Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mari Chen, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today, we are finishing the final 3 chapters of Thousand Autumns, or Qianqiu Volume 1 by Meng Xi Shi. So, without further ado, enjoy. Chapter 29 Embrace. Yuan Xiuxiu had meant her first strike as a test. If Yan Wushi had stopped her, she would have stopped before a second. But since Yan Wushi hadn't moved, Yuan Xiuxiu concluded that this kept man was of little importance to him. With a giggle, she attacked a third time without holding back in the slightest, preparing to take Shen Qiao's life in exchange for Huo Xijing's. Only this time, things were different. Her palm hadn't even touched Shen Qiao when Yuan Xiuxiu's expression transformed. She twisted in midair, folding her body into an almost impossible pose to dodge the finger that came at her from behind. She didn't hesitate for so much as a second. With her figure as light and dainty as the willow twigs of March, her toes touched down on the branch of a nearby tree. Then, in a whirl of white robes, she disappeared right before their eyes. All she left behind was a string of delicate laughter, saying, Yanlang is so cruel. Then this one will leave for now. Let's reminisce about our friendship some other day. It wasn't just Shen Qiao who hadn't thought Yan Wushi would protect him. Bian Yan Mei thought the same. He didn't dare comment on it, though. He just ran up to ask after Yan Wushi. Welcome back to Chang'an, Shuxun. It was this disciple's incompetence that led to today's events. He deserves your punishment, Shuxun. Yan Wushi didn't answer. Instead, he helped Shen Qiao up. Are you all right? Shen Qiao shook his head without replying. He was too weak to say anything. Yan Wushi simply picked him up by the waist. By this point, Shen Qiao was half unconscious, and as he had lost the ability to struggle, he looked absolutely loose-limbed. Let's head back to the city first, Yan Wushi told Bian Yan Mei. Bian Yan Mei, meanwhile, grew privately bewildered as he watched Yan Wushi. When Shen Qiao had appeared with Yan Wushi at the start of all this, he hadn't thought much of it. And then he'd been too engrossed in Yan Wushi and Yuan Xiuxiu's duel to notice when Shen Qiao killed Huo Xijing. Finally, when Yuan Xiuxiu attacked Shen Qiao and he'd seen Yan Wushi standing there unmoved, Bian Yan Mei had taken his lead and watched idly from the sidelines. But the situation hadn't unfolded in the direction he expected. Bian Yan Mei was a little confused. On the road back to the city, he took a chance and asked, Shuxun, how should I address this man? He's Shen Qiao, said Yan Wushi. Bian Yan Mei lowered his head and thought. That name sounded rather familiar. He's the sect leader of Xuandu Mountain, Yan Wushi added. What? Bian Yan Mei was thrown for a loop all over again. He gave Shen Qiao another once-over, his eyes about ready to pop right out of his skull. Who was Shen Qiao? The sect leader of Xuandu Mountain. And what kind of place was Xuandu Mountain? The #1 Taoist sect in the world. Even if they'd lost some of their magnificence after they closed off the mountain, it was still the sect that had produced Qifengge. Xuandu Mountain's name inspired deep reverence no matter who heard it. But since they were that kind of sect, how did the sect leader end up like this, in Shuxun's arms? Bian Yan Mei had heard about Shen Qiao falling from the cliff during his appointed duel with Kunye, but he'd been focusing most of his energies on the court of Northern Zhou at the time. He hadn't gone to watch the battle himself, and though his Shirdi Yu Shengyan went to Banbu Peak to train, they hadn't had the chance to meet and chat about it, so Bian Yan Mei didn't know any of the details. He coughed politely. I heard that Shen Qiao inherited Qifengge's mantle and is ranked among the top 10 in the world. Why couldn't he even take 3 strikes from Yuan Xiuxiu? Only half of his martial arts are left. Besides, lately I've been keeping him busy at night, so he hasn't been sleeping much. It's natural that he's a bit tired during the day. He only glossed over the topic, but Bian Yan Mei couldn't help but read into it. What did he mean, keeping him busy at night, and hasn't been sleeping much? With wording like that, of course he misunderstood. The actual situation was like this. Yan Wushi had been forcing Shen Qiao to spar with him of late, and in order to wring out Shen Qiao's potential, Yan Wushi never went easy on him. Consequently, Shen Qiao had to use all his energy to meet the challenge, and time and again he was pulled back from the verge of death. Then, during the day, Yan Wushi forced him to discuss martial topics such as demonic cores and Taoist cores. After many days of this, his body couldn't take it anymore, and so he hadn't been able to stop himself from falling asleep after killing Huo Xijing. Perhaps Yan Wushi had no intention of examining what his disciple was thinking, or perhaps he'd left it ambiguous on purpose. Whatever the case, his words led Bian Yanmei to develop some massive misconceptions. When he looked at Shen Qiao again, it was through a different lens. When Shen Qiao woke up, he was already inside the junior preceptor's residence. Yan Wushi wasn't there. He'd been called away by the Emperor of Zhou, but Bian Yanmei had taken a great interest in Shen Qiao and decided to dawdle there for a while longer, in no hurry to leave. When the subordinates came to report that Shen Qiao was awake, he went to see him. That was how Bian Yanmei discovered that a sleeping Shen Qiao and a wide-awake Shen Qiao were completely different. Unconscious, Shen Qiao looked soft and harmless, like a pushover. Anyone who'd seen him in Yan Wushi's arms like that would have misunderstood their relationship. Bian Yanmei's thoughts had gone down that path. After the incident, he'd sent some people to look into the story, then combined it with what he'd seen and heard. He easily came to the conclusion that this sect leader of Xuandu Mountain had been gravely injured after losing to Kunye. Lacking the face to return to Xuandu Mountain and having met Shitsun, Shen Qiao put up a token of resistance before agreeing to become Shitsun's kept man. Thus, he'd gained Shitsun's protection. As such a thing was rather dishonorable, he dared not expose his identity to outsiders and certainly didn't dare to spread word of his circumstances. But when Bian Yanmei saw Shen Qiao awake and neatly dressed, sitting at the table, he was no longer sure of his conjecture. Because although this man's complexion was as pale as before, his eyes dull and his face so pretty it was practically otherworldly, it was very hard to connect him to the image of a kept man who relied on others for his survival. Sect leader Shen has come a long way to be our guest, but I'm afraid that Shitsun will be busy for the next few days. You can stay here at the junior preceptor's residence. If you have need of anything, just tell the servants. Thank you, Bian Xianxiang. I've been a lot of trouble for you. Bian Yanmei burst out laughing. Shitsun brought you here with him. The junior preceptor's residence belongs to Shitsun, so this is all part of my job. What trouble is there to speak of? He was a little disappointed at the moment, thinking of Qi Fengge's magnificence as the world's #1 martial artist and how his disciple had been reduced to a kept man. It was beyond pitiable. If he'd died in battle back in the beginning, all his troubles would have been over, and he'd leave a tragic and glorious legacy behind. And now he was living such an ignoble existence. How awful was that? Shen Qiao shook his head. I killed Huo Xijing because he was bristling with evil, and his sins were unpardonable. The only way I could prevent him from ruining more lives was to stop a killer by killing him myself. But Huo Xijing was a member of He Huan's sect. I hope it won't complicate things for you. Bian Yanmei hadn't thought that was what Shen Qiao had been referring to. He froze for a moment, then said, He Huan sect has been at odds with Huan Yue sect for a long time, and Huo Xijing also killed my servant. If anything, I ought to thank sect leader Shen for killing him. Shen Qiao smiled in self-ridicule. If someone wanted to kill a person, I would normally try to talk them out of doing it. How hypocritical of me. But running into someone like Huo Xijing, I was the one who couldn't restrain myself. Clearly, all the cultivation I'd done for my mind and temperament were just me lying to myself. His complexion was bloodless and pale, and he looked exhausted. Even his words of self-ridicule sounded mild and meek, and lacked any real heat. Despite himself, Bian Yanmei felt a trace of pity well up inside him, so he took to comforting Shen Qiao. Actually, Confucians have this saying too. If you repay evil with virtue, how can you repay virtue? Huo Xijing was absolutely sinister. Even though we all came from the noble discipline, I had no feelings toward him A lot of people would probably thank you for his death. The two of them chatted for a while longer before Bien Mei noticed how fatigued Shen Chao looked. Only then did he get up and take his leave. Once he exited the door and was greeted by the cool wind against his face, he snapped out of it and remembered that when he first went in, he'd looked down on Shen Chao to some extent. After their conversation, not only was his contempt completely gone, he even felt that Shen Chao was rather amiable. Bien Mei couldn't help but feel close to him. Shen Chao had clearly sensed his thoughts, so he deliberately brought up Huo Xijing's death. First, to remind Bien Mei of the favor he'd done him, and second, to let Bien Mei know that, although he was staying with his Shitsuan, he wasn't anyone's property. When he realized this, the last tiny drop of contempt within Bien Mei vanished completely, fading away like smoke. When Yan Wushi returned, Shen Xiao was playing Wei Qi in his room. Having no opponent, he played against himself, holding the white pieces in one hand and black in the other. His eyes were closed, and his fingers felt among the pieces on the board, memorizing the layout. He made his moves very slowly, spending a long time thinking each one over. But every time he placed a piece, it would sit precisely on an intersection of the grid, without the slightest deviation. Shen Qiao's martial arts were slowly recovering, but his vision was more erratic. Sometimes it was good, other times bad. During the good periods, he could see some blurry shapes, but when it was bad, he was perfectly blind. He'd come to peace with this reality, but still needed to prepare and plan for the worst. So he trained himself to use his hearing and other senses to perceive the world around him. Yan Wushi stood at the entrance. He watched him for a long time before entering. Shen Qiao didn't notice at first. His entire energies focused on the game of Wei Qi. It was only when Yan Wushi put some of the things he'd been holding down on the low table that he opened his eyes a little. He scrutinized the blurred silhouette that came into his line of sight. Sect Leader Yan? When he was sure of the visitor's identity, Shen Qiao smiled, unbidden. Yan Wushi said, I heard that when you were outside today, you encountered Princess Qingdu. You even received her favor? Shen Qiao burst out laughing. I did bump into her, but it didn't go so far as a favor. The princess is the pride of heaven. I'm only a commoner. Sect Leader Yan must be joking. Yan Wushi hadn't restricted Shen Qiao's freedom of movement after he arrived in Chang'an, so Shen Qiao could wander about the city as he pleased whenever he wished to do so. That was as far as it went, though. The gate guards had already received Bien Mei's instructions regarding what to do if Shen Qiao tried to leave the city. He'd stop him immediately and report the matter to the residents. Yan Wushi chuckled. You may be wrong. I heard that when you went with Yu Shengyan to Yecheng, you met Han Feng's daughter. Didn't you receive her regard too? It's a pity that Princess Qingdu is the serious type. If she knew you lived at my residence, she'd definitely think you were someone improper. And you'd miss out on a wonderful marriage opportunity. If you married a princess, you could return to Xuandu Mountain with no trouble at all, couldn't you? You'd have the power of the court behind you. Is Sect Leader Yan a bit too bored? Shen Qiao asked helplessly. I only exchanged a few words with Princess Qingdu. How did you twist it into this? Yan Wushi stroked Shen Qiao's face, his tone frivolous. Are you taking Princess Qingdu for the daughter of some humble family? Do you think she'd chat up just anyone? You may have lost your martial arts and your status, but you still have this face. Your face alone is enough to attract many admirers. Was Mu Tipuo not one? I think that the next time you go out, you should take a lesson from those noble ladies and wear a veil. That way, you won't ruin all these romantic troubles. Otherwise, if word gets out and people say that my kept man is flirting around about town, how could I bear the embarrassment? According to Shen Qiao's understanding of Yan Wushi, this sort of enthusiastic teasing meant one of two things. Either his mood was fantastic, or his mood was terrible. He just didn't know which one it was today. Sure enough, he heard Yan Wushi say the next moment, I have some good news to tell you, along with some bad news. Which one would you like to hear first? Is it good news for me? Asked Shen Qiao. Or good news for sect leader Yan? Of course it's for you, said Yan Wushi. How could you make such malicious assumptions of me? I'm heartbroken. As he spoke, he pressed in closer, his voice dropping low and tinged with a hint of flirtatiousness. No matter how many times this exact situation played out these days, Shen Qiao could never get used to it. He angled his head slightly away, avoiding the warm breath that wafted onto his face. He might have been able to turn his head away, but his ear was still vulnerable. The shell and lobe of his ear flushed with a soft layer of pink like a scarlet mark on white jade. Anyone would long to touch it. And Yan Wushi did exactly that. Shen Qiao had nowhere to hide. He had to raise a hand to block him. With one sitting and the other leaning over, the two of them engaged dozens of moves in an instant. Unsurprisingly, this ended with Shen Qiao being pulled into Yan Wushi's arms. Yan Wushi clicked his tongue. You're too skinny. Holding you doesn't feel good at all. He released Shen Qiao and shoved him away. Shen Qiao didn't bother with a response. Though, your hands feel quite nice, Yan Wushi added. Shen Qiao's fingers were long and slender. Because of his illness, they'd become pale and cold and felt quite nice to the touch. Yan Wushi played with Shen Qiao's hand the way he'd play with the piece of white jade, and in doing so, he thawed the chill from it, enclosing it in warmth. Then it was more like handling a piece of warm jade. Yan Wushi always did as he pleased and never considered anyone else's feelings. He only cared how it made him feel. Whether Shen Qiao enjoyed it didn't matter. In fact, if Shen Qiao didn't enjoy it, Yan Wushi would find it quite amusing. Then he'd probably take it even further. Sure enough, he looked up to see Shen Qiao's expression and laughed. Ah, Qiao, are you upset again? I was even going to give you the news about Xuandu Mountain. Don't you want to know what it is? While Yan Wushi's guard was down, Shen Qiao took the chance to snatch his fingers away, then smoothly pulled his hand back and tucked it into his sleeve, refusing to show another inch of it. Yan Wushi looked at his sleeve a little sadly before saying, It's unfortunate you left Xuandu Mountain straight away instead of staying to check out the Jade Terrace discussion. I heard that Li Qingyu, the disciple of Chunyang Monastery's Yi Pichun, came down their mountain for the first time and immediately defeated the monk Xueting's disciple, Lian Sheng. He defeated He Siyong from Linchuan Academy as well, and he won against two of Xuandu Mountain's elders. In the end, your Yushidi was forced to join the fray. He bested Li Qingyu, but only by half a move. The name Li Qingyu of Qingcheng Mountain's Chunyang Monastery shocked the entire audience that day. He shook the world itself. Shen Qiao's face showed surprise at this news. Li Qingyu? I've heard that he's Yi Pichun's beloved final disciple, but he's rarely made an appearance in public. That's right, said Yan Wushi. And Xuandu Mountain's Jade Terrace discussion was the first battle to propel him to fame. Liansheng and He Siyong were both Jianghu experts of the younger generation. They weren't comparable to the world's top 10, but not many people in the rest of the Jianghu could match them. Li Qingyu did lose to Yu Ai in the end, but given Yu Ai's status and seniority, it was an honor, not a disgrace, to lose by half a move. One had to take into consideration that Yu Ai was Qi Fengge's disciple, and Qi Fengge had been the top martial artist in the world. If Li Qingyu could lose with only half a move's difference, didn't that mean they were already on almost equal footing, and that Li Qingyu could surpass Yu Ai? He was very young, and this was his first time leaving his sect's mountain to enter the secular world. Yet, he'd already achieved so much. Given enough time, who's to say he wouldn't become the new #1 martial artist in the world? Meanwhile, as far as Xuandu Mountain went, first of all, Shen Qiao had fallen to Kunye. Of course, there were extenuating circumstances, but outsiders didn't know the full story, so they just believed that Shen Qiao was unworthy of his name, that his martial arts must have been far inferior to his master's. Then Yu had invited the world's Taoist sects to the Jade Terrace discussion in order to officially announce Xuandu Mountain's re-entry into the secular world, and, incidentally, to build up Xuandu Mountain's reputation through combat, leaving the public in awe. No one predicted that someone like Li Qingyu would show up at just the wrong time. Not only did the Jade Terrace discussions not rekindle the public's awe of Xuandu Mountain, it established a reputation for Li Qingyu instead. Which wasn't to say that Xuandu Mountain had fallen to a second or third rate sect after this, but it could only feel like a calamitous bout of bad luck to Yu and the others. When outsiders mention Xuandu Mountain now, it would inevitably be with a bit more delicacy and a bit less reverence. After all, there was only one Qifengge. Xuandu Mountain couldn't return to its former magnificence without him. No wonder he'd sealed off the mountain and made his exit from the secular world. He must have known long ago that the next generation of disciples would be disappointing. So he'd been forced to make this unwise decision. That was what everyone would think. Shen Qiao was keen and perceptive. Yan Wushi had barely said anything, but he'd already guessed much of what was going on between the lines. Chapter 30. Attending the Banquet. Shen Qiao said, I'd heard a while ago that Yi Pichun accepted a disciple in his late years, a gifted genius with incredible foundations, who'd already read and memorized every book in Chunyang Monastery at 15 years old. But back then, Yi Pichun didn't show him to the public and commanded him to travel the western region's Kunlun Mountains alone. In hindsight, Yi Pichun was indeed prescient. He took 10 years to sharpen one sword. Its radiance was bound to be unparalleled the moment it was unsheathed. You've always loved being a good guy, Yan Wushi said curiously. But after this, Xuandu Mountain's title as the number one Taoist sect might have to change hands. Your Shudi suffered a huge loss, and your sect was humiliated. But instead of being upset or heartbroken over it, you're heaping praise on Li Qingyu. Yu is conceited and too extreme, said Shen Qiao. He needed to learn a lesson. It's good for him. How can anything remain number one forever? Life has its ups and downs. The sects are no exception. Yan Wushi laughed. Truly a positive thinker. Didn't sect leader Yan say that there was good news and bad news? What was the good news? I told you the good news, said Yan Wushi. Li Qingyu stole the limelight from Xuandu Mountain, and that Yushidi of yours was humiliated. Isn't that good news for you? Shen Qiao felt like he was nearing the end of his rope. Then, the bad news? The bad news is, the thing you were worried about finally happened. Yu might truly be in bed with the Gokturks. Shen Qiao frowned. How so? Yan Wushi deliberately paused for a good while until Shen Qiao couldn't help but lean forward, revealing an eager expression. Only then did Yan Wushi reply slowly. Right after the Jade Terrace discussion, an envoy from Ishbara Kagan ascended Xuandu Mountain and asked them to send a preacher to the eastern Gokturk Khaganate. Shen Qiao's brow wrinkled further. You know who Ishbara Kagan is? Shen Qiao nodded. He hadn't been wasting all his free time. Besides comprehending the Juyang, he'd also been keeping an eye on major world events. The Gokturk Khaganate held great power in those days, so much so that even northern Qi and Zhou had to feign politeness and deference while dealing with them. But the Gokturk's political and social system differed greatly from the Han one. Although Taspar Khagan was the Khaganate's supreme ruler, he'd also appointed his nephew and his younger brother to supervise the eastern and western Khaganate, respectively. And this Ishbara Khagan of the east was precisely Taspar Khagan's nephew, also known as Shetu. Rumor said that he was a man of lofty ambitions, no less than his uncle Taspar Khagan, and that he was destined for greatness. Xuandu Mountain was thousands of kilometers away from the Khaganate, and they hadn't been involved in secular affairs for years. The fact that they'd established a connection to the Gokturks so soon after their return inevitably drew such speculation. Shen Qiao immediately thought of Yu Ai plotting with Kunye to throw him off the cliff. But how would a close relationship with the Gokturks benefit Xuandu Mountain? Shen Qiao said, "This is like asking a tiger for its skin." Yan Wushi chuckled. "Not necessarily. The Gokturks are so powerful, anyone who doesn't want a war is forced to make concessions to them. Didn't the Emperor of Zhou marry a Gokturk empress after all?" Shen Qiao shook his head. "The Lord of Zhou seized power back from Yuan Hu, and he'd reigned for many years since then. He must have seen all kinds of difficult situations. I heard that he intentionally distanced himself from Lady Ashina to avoid being controlled by the Gokturks. So he's clearly a wise man. Yu Ai is clever, but Xuandu Mountain was secluded for too long, and he's overconfident if he thinks he can work with the Gokturks. I fear he'll suffer greatly for it in the end." Yan Wushi picked up the invitation he laid down on the table just before he shoved it into Shen Qiao's hands. "As far as Xuandu Mountain is concerned, you're just an outcast disciple now. Why waste your energy on them? Here's an invitation to your birthday party. I don't have time to go, but I'm sure you'll be interested." As the candlelight was dim, Shen Qiao didn't open his eyes to examine it and instead skimmed his hand over the invitation for some time. His fingers were slender and smooth, and using only the faintly raised ink marks of the surface, he read the words, Su Wei. He tilted his head, dubious. "I don't know this person." "Su Wei, also known as Su Wu Wei," said Yan Wushi. "He's the Duke of Meiyang County and is married to Yuan Hu's daughter." That should have put him in hot water politically, but he's a talented man. The Emperor of Zhou appreciates talent and wanted to elevate him. But Su Wu Wei claimed he was ill and resigned. Now he studies at home. The day after tomorrow is his mother's 50th birthday, and even the Emperor has sent her gifts of congratulations. However, Yan Wushi moved on, Su Wu Wei has a brother named Su Qiao, and that one's a martial artist. Can you guess who his master is? Seeing how Shen Qiao was listening with rapt attention, he moved to grab his hand and toy with it again. But Shen Qiao's guard had been up for some time. He simply put his hands behind his back. After a while, he seemed to realize that this reaction was somewhat childish, so he moved his hands back in front of himself and tucked them into his sleeves instead. Yan Wushi clicked his tongue. "I'm feeding you and housing you, and I'm even bringing you all this news, but you're so stingy. You won't even let me touch your hand." Shen Qiao remained unmoved. "There are countless beauties within this residence who'd come to serve you themselves if sect leader Yan wishes." "Ah, Qiao, you're so boring." So Yan Wushi said, but he still went on to tell Shen Qiao. "Su Qiao is from Chunyang Monastery, and he's the Shixiong of the one who lost to Yu Ai by just half a move, Li Qingyu." Shen Qiao considered this for a while. "Li Qingyu is well known, and I've heard about him before, but I don't think I've heard much about this Su Qiao." "He comes from an aristocratic family," said Yan Wushi, "and above him is Su Wei, who acts like both a father and brother to him. It makes sense that his exploits aren't as high profile as Li Qingyu's. However, since there are martial siblings, and the day after tomorrow is Su Wei and Su Qiao's mother's birthday, Li Qingyu very well might be in attendance. Don't you want to meet this rising star who single-handedly took on Xuandu Mountain and who nearly defeated your Shidi?" Shen Qiao brushed his fingers over the words of the invitation and nodded slightly. "I understand. Thank you, Sect Leader Yan." Smiling, Yan Wushi said, "I have no dealings with the Su family, but because of my status, they had to send me an invitation, though they'd never expect me to actually attend. If you want to go with my invitation, bring a congratulatory gift on my behalf. That should be sufficient courtesy." It was rather strange that someone like him would care about courtesy, but Shen Qiao didn't think too much of it. All right. Su Wei came from the Su family in the capital, a great and famous clan. His father, Su Chuo, had been an important official in Western Wei, and his wife, Lady Yuan, was the daughter of Yuan Hu. which was to say, Lady Yuan was the niece of the current Emperor Zhou. Although he'd killed Yuan Hu, he allowed his family to live. He even took good care of this niece. It was typical in these times for most notable families to marry into the royal family, inextricably linking them together. The Su family was no exception. It was the Su matriarch's birthday, and guests streamed in endlessly for the celebration. Their gates were flooded with horses and carriages, causing a traffic jam. The Su family was forced to specially assign someone to stand by the gates and direct traffic so as not to hold on any passers-by. Shen Qiao, too, had arrived by carriage. Su Wei, who was still receiving guests inside, became alarmed as soon as the junior preceptor's carriage arrived. Yan Wushi held no actual position within the court, but the Emperor of Zhou placed great trust in Huan Yue's sect. It was purportedly Huan Yue's sect's support that had enabled him to kill Yuan Hu and seize back power. Su Wei was the archetypal scholar official. He wasn't interested in politics, but he also didn't want to make enemies. He'd sent an invitation to Yan Wushi only out of courtesy and hadn't expected someone from the junior preceptor's residence to actually attend. When he heard someone had, he hurried to greet the guest personally. When the man opened the carriage alighted, Su Wei froze for a moment. Regardless of how little contact he'd had with Yan Wushi, he could still tell that the man before him was definitely not Yan Wushi. "May I ask if your distinguished self is—" "This one is Shen Qiao. Sect leader Yan was summoned by His Majesty and cannot make it tonight. So this Shen came on his behalf to offer congratulations. He asks for Duke Su's forgiveness." His explanation, taken together with how he'd arrived in the junior preceptor's carriage, put Su Wei at ease. The host smiled. "I see. Please come inside, Shen Xiansheng." Though he'd welcomed the man inside, he was still a bit puzzled. Yan Wushi was from the Jianghu. This Su Wei knew, and he'd also heard from his brother Su Qiao that Huan Yue's sect was considered by many to be a demonic sect. But the man in front of him looked like neither a martial artist nor a court official. He looked ill, but his poise was remarkable, almost otherworldly. Could he be a scholar friend of Yan Wushi's? He wasn't the only one puzzled. Many guests had seen the host personally go out to greet and welcome a blind man, and they were curious too. Yan Wushi's name carried thunderous impact within northern Zhou, but few people had actually met him in person. Many people, seeing Shen Qiao follow Su Wei inside, assumed that he was the leader of Huan Yue's sect. But then they saw that famously reserved Princess Qingdu walking up to greet him, and they became even more curious. Because of Su Qiao, the guests weren't all ministers from powerful families. There were also martial artists from the Jianghu. Chunyang Monastery's leader Yi Pichun hadn't come himself, but he'd sent his disciple, Li Qingyu. He'd caused quite a stir a few times days ago at Xuandu Mountain's Jade Terrace Taoist conference, and everyone had heard of him. Since Chunyang Monastery had the potential to replace Xuandu Mountain, everyone wanted a piece of them, so quite a few people had gathered around him. As martial brothers, Su Qiao and Li Qingyu got along rather well. Su Qiao introduced Li Qingyu to the Su family circle, which had connections that went back generations. When Li Qingyu exchanged pleasantries with other martial artists, he pulled Su Qiao over too, helping to raise his Shuxiong's profile. Shen Qiao politely declined Princess Qingdu's invitation to sit beside her and sat instead in the seat the host had arranged for him. As he was representing Yan Wushi, his seat was, of course, decently situated. The guest sitting beside him noticed that his vision was lacking, so when the maid brought the dishes over, he specifically asked her to move Shen Qiao's portions to his right-hand side, making it easier for him to reach them with his chopsticks. Shen Qiao expressed his gratitude for the man's kindness. "Thank you, sir. This humble one is Shen Qiao. May we know this gentleman's esteemed name?" The other party laughed. It was nothing. Just a few extra words. Shen Langjun need not be so polite. "This one is of the Puliuru family, first name Jian. It's a pleasure to meet you. Even though Puliu Rujian was sitting next to Shen Qiao, he asked nothing of his background or identity, nor did he express any curiosity or concerns about Shen Qiao's eyes. He only talked about the host, Su Wei, saying that he was talented and widely renowned, as well as a master of poetry and proficient in law. Admiration and reverence shone through in his words. When they landed on the topic of poetry and literature, the three schools of thought inevitably entered the conversation. Northern Zhou esteemed Buddhism. Previously, when Yuan Hu had been in power, he'd even appointed the monk Xueting as state preceptor. Now, with Yuan Yong on the throne, the tendency towards Buddhism remained, despite his best efforts to remove all traces of Yuan Hu's influence. It wasn't something that could be wiped away so quickly. Puliu Rujian was a Buddhist, but he also had an interest in Taoism and was tolerant of its ideals. It was clear he hadn't expected Shen Qiao's profound insight into Taoism, and after chatting for a while, they quickly built up a rapport and felt a deep appreciation for each other. After they'd become acquainted, Princess Qingdu sent another person to invite Shen Qiao over to sit with her. Puliu Rujian teased him. Few people in the entire capital would be given the honor of the Princess Qingdu humbling herself to make friends with them. If this gets out, they'll all be jealous of you. I've embarrassed myself before Puliu Ruxiong, said Shen Qiao. I heard that Su Wei's brother, Su Qiao, was from Chunyang Monastery, so there are many members of the Jianghu here today. Chunyang Monastery's name likely pulled them in. Puliu Ruxiong knows these people? I used to admire the carefree lifestyle of the Jianghu. I even spent a few years imitating them, wandering around the world on horseback, so I do recognize a couple of faces. Then, can Puliu Ruxiong introduce them to me? Of course, Puliu Rujian said brightly. He then pointed out each to Shen Qiao. You recognize Su Qiao. The one next to him is Li Qingyu. The two of them together are called the twin jades of Qingcheng. Li Qingyu is the more famous one by a bit, though. You must have heard of his impressive exploits a few days ago at Xuandu Mountain. The one speaking to him is Zhang Suncheng, who comes from Zhongnan sect. Zhongnan sect isn't too well known, but Zhang Suncheng is also from a wealthy family. His marksmanship is superb. There are few who can rival him. And beside Zhang Suen Erlang, the one dressed in yellow, he's Dou Yanshan. A surprised noise escaped Shen Qiao. The leader of the Liuhe Guild? Precisely. That night, at Chu Yuan Temple, many factions had tried all sorts of tricks to get their hands on the Zhuyang strategy's volume of diluted thought. In the end, Yan Wushi took the item the Liuhe Guild had been painstakingly escorting and smashed it into dust. Yuan Fuyi and company had heard what Shen Qiao recited, but after they left, how could they guarantee what they'd written was free of mistakes? Yan Wushi had held them in the palm of his hand, his to be toyed with. Dou Yanshan must have hated him down to the bone. However, when he saw Shen Qiao walk in instead of Yan Wushi, he only sent him a glance and remained in his seat. It looked like he had no intention of coming over to exchange greetings. Puliu Rujian continued. Buddhist Master Xueting was once appointed state preceptor by Yuan Hu. That's why he and the Su family still share deep relations. Even though Yuan Hu is dead, he usually would have come to offer his congratulations, but for some reason he isn't here yet. He didn't even send a disciple. That's rather odd. Also, that man and woman to the side, they're members of Mount Tai's Bixia sect and Fanjiang province's Liuli Palace. These two sects have a good relationship with Chunyang Monastery, so that's likely why they came. The rest are nothing special, just insignificant people from ordinary sects. There's no point getting to know them, so I won't waste time on them. In actuality, there were quite a few famous martial experts from the Jianghu among those he hadn't introduced, but in the eyes of Puliu Rujian, they all became nobodies. The stronger king was the rule of the Jianghu, and here it was demonstrated to the fullest. Perhaps those people were the big fish back in their little ponds, but Pu Liu Rujian met people from the upper echelon of Zhou every day, so he thought nothing of the lot. Shen Qiao took note of every person he'd named. He was far away from them, too far for his poor eyesight, so he couldn't make out their faces clearly. Instead, he remembered the color of their clothing, as well as their build and manners. The two of them were talking when another pair of new arrivals came to the door. Shun Qiao thought he looked familiar. After he finished exchanging greetings with the host, they took a look around, and that's when Shun Qiao's gaze met theirs. Xie Shang startled a little, but only nodded. Zhang Ziqian, however, was already walking over. Shen Langjun, to think that you're here too! Shen Qiao smiled at him. So, it's Zhang Xiong. What a coincidence. Truly! Zhang Ziqian had a good impression of Shen Qiao and wanted to sit beside him for a proper conversation. But then Xie Xiang walked over. Shi Xiong, the host has already assigned us seats. Won't it be rude if you just sit around randomly? Zhang Ziqian paused reluctantly. It's a great fortune to run into Shen Langjun here. I have a favor to ask you. May I ask that Shen Langjun stay after the banquet? Shen Qiao had nothing in the slightest to do with Lingchuan Academy, and Zhang Ziqian didn't know who he actually was. They'd only met by chance. Shen Qiao really couldn't think of anything that man might ask of him, but he nodded anyway. All right. Once the Xiejian duo had left, Puliu Rujian said, Lingchuan Academy dominates Southern Chun. They're self-important and arrogant. You can tell just by looking at that Xiexiang. Zhou wants to ally with Chun to invade Qi now, so Xiexiang's company must have come along with the envoy from Chun. But they hold no sway here in Chang'an, so you don't need to show them that much courtesy. Shen Qiao smiled. Xiexiang is a bit prideful, but Zhang Ziqian is much easier to get along with, he replied. The day they dueled, Xiexiang had taken care to keep the circle of battle as small as possible, so as not to drag in the innocent people on the streets. It was evident that, although he was arrogant, there was no malice in his heart. With this in mind, Shen Qiao didn't mind his arrogance all that much. While they'd been speaking, the birthday banquet had already begun. Chapter 31. The People of the Jianghu. At this point, most of the guests had arrived, and the ball thronged with people, all of exalted status. From the royal family and renowned aristocrats to the various sects of the Jianghu, it was truly a rare gathering. And it was only possible because the two brothers led two completely different lives. During this era, the culture was quite open. Everyone had their own dinner table, and men and women were allowed to stay in the same room with only a small screen placed in the middle as a symbolic separation. The woman's side was being entertained by Sui's wife. Sui's mother, Madame Qin, sat above them in the hostess's seat. Below her and to either side were the two brothers, Su Wei and Su Qiao. Serving girls streamed in carrying fine wines and exquisite delicacies, and in the space of the moment, light-hearted chatter picked up and drifted everywhere. The guests and host both full of good cheer. Musicians sat in the hall with drums and flutes, while dancer girls in splendid dresses flowed through graceful steps. Shen Qiao couldn't see the dancers clearly, but he could make out their lithe, fluid figures, their robes fluttering as they glided like immortals alighting on earth, with flowers guiding their paths. This kind of dance, holy and pure, but with a hint of guileless sensuality, was distinct from the styles that were in fashion in the West. It was also different from the dances of Southern Chun, where the dancers' heads turned low beneath wide sleeves, jade hairpins adrift in the autumn breeze. Entertained by the refreshing novelty, the guests all cheered and applauded. After a few more rounds of wine, some of the crowds, those with a fondness for dances, began enthusiastically clapping to the beat. When Puliu Rujian saw that Shen Qiao was quite entertained by the dancing, he took the chance to explain. This dance music is called Little Heaven and comes from the Kucha. The Kucha people were devout Buddhists. Once they were gone, their music spread to the Central Plains, so this song also has a Buddhist style to it. Enlightened by the insight, Shen Qiao laughed. No wonder their shoulders are and midriffs are bare, and they wear so much jewelry. It's the Kucha style. Puliru Jian smiled back. Precisely. Just as everyone was relishing the entertainment, a servant hurried into the room. He jogged to Su Wei and whispered something into his ear. Su Wei's expression went flat, and he made a gesture. With a long, drawn-out note, the dance suddenly stopped and the music faded. The guests felt like they'd been pulled back to their senses and out of a boundless paradise. They all stared at their hosts in confusion. Su Wei stood and cupped his hands. The Empress heard that it was my mother's birthday and sent someone over especially with congratulatory gifts. I ask everyone to wait for a moment. After I receive the emissary, I will return to entertain you. The Empress of Zhou had the last name Ashina. She was a Gokturk, and the emperor had taken her as his wife in order to befriend the Gokturks. Ordinarily, she and the Su family had no dealings with each other, and as the emperor had already sent over gifts for the Su matriarch's birthday, the event should have had nothing to do with the empress. Yet, she'd made a point to send someone there with a gift. This development left everyone bewildered. They turned to look at each other at a loss. But the emissary was from the empress, so the host had to go welcome them. The music stopped and everyone sat straight back in their seats, all looking towards the door. Su Wei straightened his hem, ready to head out the door, when from beyond it came a bright laugh. No need to trouble the Duke of Meiyang County. I'll bring myself in. Most people in the hall didn't recognize this unfamiliar voice. They just thought the speaker was rather rude. Only Shen Qiao furrowed his brows, and unease growing inside him. In strolled a young man, strong and tall, with a thick beard. Though he wore the dress of the Central Plains, there was a quick, fierce air about him. His eyes were sharp and spirited, his gaze forceful and aggressive. He didn't look at Su Wei after he entered, but rather swept his gaze around the hall. Other than the martial artists, everyone he looked at felt the need to avert their eyes. They didn't say so, but each of them felt somewhat discomfited. Puliu Jian made a sound of surprise, then whispered, "That man has so much vigor and spirit. He must be a Xiantian expert. But how come I've never seen him in Chang'an before?" The entire Su family is deeply grateful for Her Majesty's favor. "May I ask for your name?" Su Wei said to the newcomer. The man smiled. "This one is Duan Wenyang. There's no need to be so courteous, Duke of Meiyang County. Your mother's compassion is well known. The Empress has heard about it for years. It's just unfortunate that they haven't had the chance to meet. So, when she heard that it was your mother's birthday, she ordered this one to come with a humble gift and express her goodwill." Su Wei cupped his hands. "We are deeply grateful for the Empress's consideration. I hereby pay my respects. As a visitor, you are our guest. If Emissary Duen has some time to spare, why not take a seat?" Since the man was representing Empress Ashina, Madame Qin and Su Qiao also bowed towards Duen Wenyang from where they sat, behind Su Wei. But Duen Wenyang laughed abruptly. "I'm not in a hurry to sit down. I have another reason for my visit here today. I wish to consult Madame Qin." Su Wei's mother was born to a prestigious family and had never been to the Gokturk Khaganate. Duen Wenyang was a Gokturk, so they obviously had nothing to do with each other. What could he consult her about? Su Wei was a bit confused. "Please speak, Emissary Duen." "Madame Qin," said Duen Wenyang, "someone has asked me to send greetings on his behalf. He would like to know if your esteemed self still remembers the person who painstakingly waited for you in the Gokturk royal court 30 years ago." Su Wei and Su Qiao were shocked. They couldn't help but look at their mother. Madame Qin's expression remained unchanged. "Young man," she said calmly, I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else. Duen Renyang laughed brightly. I just knew that Madame Chin wouldn't admit to it so easily. Would you force me to tell the entire tale in front of everyone here? By this point, Su Wei realized that Duen Renyang had come in bad faith. This distinguished gentleman is awfully rude, he said severely. Did the Empress send you not to deliver gifts but to pick a fight? The Su family has not grievance nor grudge with the Empress, and we have no connection to her. So why must she treat my mother so discourteously at her birthday banquet? I will report this matter to His Majesty. Guards, escort this guest out. At his order, the Su family servants rushed over to pull Duen Renyang away, but he only shook his sleeves slightly, and everyone around him fell to the ground. The seated guests all rose to their feet, staring at Duen Renyang in shock. Some of them looked displeased and prepared to reprimand him on the host's behalf. How dare you make trouble here? Su Chao said angrily. Do you take us for a family of pushovers? As he spoke, he prepared to attack, but Duen Renyang took a step back and spoke up loudly. Wait! I have something to say. Once I finish, you can do as you wish. This matter is of extreme importance, and all of you here are honorable people of great virtue and prestige. I ask all of you esteemed guests to also make your own judgments. Decide whether I'm only raising ruckus for no reason or if Madame Chin has a guilty conscience. Before anyone could make a move, he leapt to continue. I ask Madame Chin to please return my Shitsuin's keepsake. Su Chao was furious. Gok-Turk bastard, making unfounded accusations. My mother comes from a prestigious family in Guangzhou. How could she possibly have such connections to your Gok-Turks? If you don't explain yourself clearly and restore my mother's reputation, you won't be able to leave even if you want to. He drew his sword. The blade's glare overflowed like water, killing intent lurking beneath its surface. Li Qingyu stepped out from the crowd. What you eat is your business, but what you say is ours, he said, his words slow and steady. Madame Chin is my Shishong's mother, so I respect her as if she were my own. If you continue to maliciously slander her, Chunyang Monastery will see this matter through to the end. The implication within his words was clear. Even if Su Wei didn't make an official complaint and pursue the matter in court, Chunyang Monastery would still take it upon themselves to make enemies of Duen Renyang and his master. It wasn't too long ago that Li Qingyu had ascended Xuandu Mountain on his own and defended Liansheng, He Siyong, and others before losing to Yu Ai by half a move. Chunyang Monastery's prestige had silently overtaken Xuandu Mountains after that. What was more, their leader Yi Pichun was among the top 10. So Li Qingyu's words carried a lot of weight. Duen Renyang was unperturbed. He laughed just as before and said, You can travel the entire land for a righteous cause. Without one, you cannot move a single step. I've heard that the Central Plains loves their righteousness. That's why I came here, to seek justice. But could it be that today you refuse to discriminate between green and red or black and white? That you mean to use your influence to intimidate people? Madame Chin denied it categorically, and you listened to her. Why not listen to what I have to say? Madame Chin's first name is Ning, and her courtesy name is Shuang Han. Am I correct? The Su brothers were shaken. Their hearts pounded at his words. Knowledge of the maiden name could be explained away, but their mother's courtesy name was known to very few, and certainly not Empress Ashina. So how had this random Gokturk come to know of it? Unflagging, Duen Renyang began to explain. 30 years ago, Qin Shuang Han traveled to the Gokturk Khaganate and became my master's disciple. One night, by taking advantage of his favor and trust, she stole away my master's keepsake and took it with her back to the Central Plains. Now my master has commanded me to find this person and ask for the keepsake back. I have searched long and hard ever since I arrived in the Central Plains. In an unexpected turn of events, I had the chance to encounter with her in Chang'an. Only then did I realize that Qin Shuanghan, who I couldn't find anywhere, was the Duke of Meiyang County's mother, Madame Qin. He paused to chuckle before going on. Madame Qin has hidden herself well all these years. Who would have suspected that this Madame Qin, who never leaves the house, used to be the renowned Aisale outside the Great Walls? Utter nonsense, cried Su Qiao. My mother has never been beyond the wall or to the Kaganate. If you're seeking your martial siblings, look for them yourself. Why besmirch our family name? You think you can push us around so easily? Duen Renyang raised an eyebrow. Madam Qin, will you deny the things you've done? He asked loudly. If I remember correctly, the ring you wear on your right hand is a holy relic of my people. It's also the keepsake that represents the identity of my master. The ring has an engraving depicting the golden lotus specifically of our people. Could this, too, be a coincidence? With this incriminating declaration, everyone fell into a confusion. They were compelled to turn and look at Madame Qin's hand. On her hand was indeed a ring. Its surface was inlaid with crystals, and beneath them was a faint gold pattern. Light flowed over it in the spills of color. It was a beautiful sight. Seeing that today's events would be near impossible to resolve, Su Wei was silently flooded with regret. He wished he'd prevented Duen Wenyang from entering the house in the first place. No matter what you intend to do, today is Madame Qin's birthday, said Princess Qingdu severely. We all came here to sit down happily and celebrate, yet you've chosen to create a disturbance at this time specifically. You even said it was on the Empress's orders. If that's the case, then come to the palace with me. We can speak to the Empress directly. I am deeply interested in why she would send you to ruin someone else's birthday. Duen Wenyang remained calm and unflustered. The Empress sent me to deliver a gift, and I have delivered it. So, I've already fulfilled the Empress's orders. The current matter is my master's. His Majesty is wise and just. If his respect itself were to learn of the ins and outs of this tale, I'm certain he wouldn't stop me from asking Madame Qin to return what's ours. He proudly continued, Furthermore, my master is world-renowned. He has no need to deliberately target Madame Qin. Who's your master? Asked Li Qingyu. Duen Wenyang smiled faintly. Hulu Gu of the Gokturks. The attendant crowd fell into an uproar. His words had stunned them beyond belief. What kind of person was Hulugu? 20 years ago, he fought Qifengge, the #1 martial artist then. Their duel was famous throughout the land, and people still took great delight in discussing it all these years later. Hulugu had lost and been forced to swear that he would not enter the Central Plains for 20 years. And he'd kept his promise. For the next 20 years, he never once set foot in the Central Plains. Martial artists of Qifengge and Hulugu's caliber rarely lost their lives, even in defeat. Though Qifengge's prowess was first in the world, Hulugu hadn't been far behind him. Qifengge couldn't kill him, so he'd forced him to swear an oath. Given Yan Wusher's propensities, if he had the chance to make Hulugu swear an oath, he might have simply told Hulugu to kill himself. Then they could have avoided all future troubles by pulling up the grass by its roots. But that obviously wasn't Qifengge's way of doing things. He'd noticed the Gokturks' ambitions and their designs on the Central Plains, but he also respected Hulugu. They were both grandmasters of their generation, so he'd been unwilling to humiliate his opponent, and hence he had established the 20-year covenant. 20 years later, Qifengge had passed away, and Hulugu never re-entered the Central Plains. Instead, 2 of his disciples arrived. One was Kunye, who defeated Shen Qiao at Banbu Peak. The other paid an abrupt visit to the Su residence and claimed that Su Wei and Su Qiao's mother was Hulugu's disciple. The first matter was old news. After Shen Qiao had fallen, Xuandu Mountain changed masters. Gradually, people stopped paying attention to the previous leader's whereabouts, though some still inevitably sighed when that duel was mentioned. thinking that Qifeng had no one left to carry on his legacy. But the second matter playing out right before their eyes revealed an absolutely earth-shattering secret. No matter whether it was true or false, Madame Teen's reputation had already been damaged. Su Qiao flew into a rage. Without another word, he grabbed his sword, intending to force Duan Wenyang to shut up. Right at that moment, Madame Teen spoke up from behind the son who shielded her. If Hulugu wants his keepsake, why not come get it himself? Why send you instead? A confession lay implied in her words, that Duan Wenyang had spoken the truth. Su Qiao froze and looked back in disbelief. Mother, you... Madame Qin shot him a look. You what? She asked calmly. Do you understand what this keepsake is for? The golden lotus is the symbol of the Gokturks, and it's also the sacred emblem of Zoroastrianism. As long as he had this ring in hand, Hulagu could call for all of the martial experts in Persia, Tuyuhun, Khotan, and Tangut, and to gather in the Khaganate and support the Gokturk Khagan in invading the Central Plains. Back then, Northern Zhou hadn't even been established, and Eastern and Western Wei were embroiled in endless wars, weakening each other more and more. They couldn't withstand a large-scale invasion from the north. The Gokturks would ravage the Central Plains. I took away the keepsake so that Hulagu could no longer proclaim himself the true successor of Zoroastrianism and call together the experts from beyond the Great Wall. Without this, the Gokturks lost a limb. Tell me, was what I did wrong? The two brothers, Su Wei and Su Qiao, had never dreamed that their mother had such a past. Hearing about it now, they were utterly stupefied. Madame Qin turned back to Duan Wenyang and said, This ring indeed belonged to Hulugu, and I was the one who brought it back to the Central Plains. But that was a long time ago. Hulugu never sought it out before, so why send you more than 30 years later? Duan Wenyang was perfectly composed. It was my master's last request before he passed away. As his disciple, I'm obligated to fulfill it for him. Madame Qin flinched a little, but she didn't seem surprised. She was silent for a long time before saying only 5 words. So that's why. That's why. Since Madame Qin has admitted to it, this should be easy to resolve. Could you please hand over the ring so I can carry out my master's last request? After saying so, he seemed to recall something. He looked all around before his gaze finally landed on Shen Qiao, as if he just noticed him. Ah, what a coincidence! Sect leader Shen is here as well. In that case, can I trouble your esteemed self to act as our witness? All right, everyone, we have officially made it through the entire first volume of Thousand Autumns, or Qianqiu, by Meng Xi Shi. I don't know about you guys, I've already said it a few times before, but I absolutely enjoyed this reading. I've already read Thousand Autumns completely through, but part of it, actually, the majority of it, I read the fan translations. So I have all the books and I decided, you know what, I want to read it again. And honestly, it feels like I'm reading it again for the first time. And I am not a very political person. At least in my country. I hate American politics. But when I read this, I'm so enthralled by everything from the martial arts to the politics to, the chemistry between Shen Qiao and Yan Wushi, even though Shen Qiao does not really like him, but getting used to him. And I just love everything about this god dang series. Like, oh my gosh, I don't want to ramble. So I'm going to stop here and just say the next video will commence the beginning of volume 2 of Thousand Autumns. So I hope you guys have a great day or a great night, and I'll see you next time.